It is that time. It's 10:40 and you are here at a demonstration of feedback-informed treatment. I'm grateful that you showed up, and I hope to illustrate together with my colleague Bob Bertolino, who is a professor at Maryville University in St. Louis and one of the ICCE, that is the International Center for Clinical Excellence, senior associates. Bob is also the person who edited the manuals, the FIT or feedback-informed treatment manuals, together with a number of other people that are here in the audience, that lay out how to incorporate feedback into your work. So I thought I would start by doing a brief introduction to feedback-informed work, and then Bob has graciously agreed to work with me as if he were a client, filling out the measures, and then if there's any time left at the end, we'll have you come up to the microphones and ask. Sound like a deal? Perfect. So if we can go back to the slides for a minute, this is a demonstration of feedback-informed work. What is FIT? FIT is a pan-theoretical approach for evaluating and improving the quality and quality and effectiveness of behavioral health services. Essentially, it involves routinely and formally soliciting feedback from consumers regarding the alliance and the outcome of care, and then using the resulting information to both inform and improve service delivery. So it's not associated with a particular way of working or model, and it is not a treatment model. We don't have a way of thinking about how change happens, merely it's a way for evaluating whatever methods you might use to find out, is your client engaged in the process, and is that engagement leading to improvement in their lives? One more time, back to the slides. And FIT, we say, is not only consistent with, but operationalizes the definition of evidence-based practice. There is a lot of talk about evidence-based practices outside these walls and, of course, at this conference. Exactly what is it? People who develop models are inclined to treat that term as a noun, as if an evidence-based practice is the model that they practice. That is not any recognized definition of what evidence-based practice is. Evidence-based practice, according to APA's definition, which is the same, by the way, as the Institute of Medicine, which is the same in many places outside of the United States, Canada, and Europe, FIT involves the integration of the best available research. What do we know? Early change in treatment is a good predictor of change throughout the treatment process. What else do we know? Engagement, one of the best predictors of treatment outcome. What predicts client engagement? What predicts client engagement is the alliance, the best integration of the best available research and monitoring of patient progress and of changes in the patient's circumstances, such as job loss or major illness, that may suggest the need to adjust the treatment. Well, what do you adjust if you're going to adjust the treatment? Look at the definition. Again, this is straight out of APA's definition, which was published in May 2006 in the American Psychologist. And it says, problems in the therapeutic relationship or in the implementation of the goals of treatment. That is evidence-based practice. In other words, evidence-based practice is a verb, not a noun. And what we have to do is monitor and measure to make sure that our clients are getting what they came for in the treatment process. Our particular way of doing FIT, which was approved in February by SAMHSA as an evidence-based practice, you can see that if you go to the samhsa.gov website and search for the Partners for Change Outcome Management System International Center for Clinical Excellence version. We now have about 13 randomized clinical trials, thousands of culturally, economically diverse clients. What we find is that routine outcome monitoring and feedback as much as doubles the effect size of the services individual providers give. Number two, it decreases dropout rates by about half. Number three, it decreases deterioration rates by about a third. If you're simply monitoring the outcome and the alliance of your care and then discussing it with your clients. Number four, it reduces hospitalizations and shortens lengths of stay by about 2/3. And last but not least, significantly reduces the cost of care compared to non-feedback groups in the randomized clinical trials. So I think there's fairly good news about incorporating some way of monitoring outcome and alliance in care. Our particular way, and it is just one way, there are other groups that have measures as well. I am not suggesting our measures are the best measures ever on the planet. I will tell you this, they are free. And you can get them, thank you, Mom. Uh, you can get them on my website at scottdmiller.com/performance metrics. We do ask that you complete and agree to the terms of a licensing condition. That license basically says if you do something silly with the measures, I don't know, rolling them up into little doobies and smoking them with your client, that shit's on you. What we give you in exchange is the measure, and you can get them again on the website. When you use the measures, you can use them in paper and pencil format, or you can get fancy and use an electronic program. There are a variety of ones. I license the measures to a number of groups that do that. And when you do that, you can actually get feedback about your effectiveness. Let me just switch the slide deck here and show you what this might look like. So you would get data that sums up your clients and gives you information about how many clients you're seeing, the number of sessions, the average number of sessions, treatment length, and if you look all the way down to where it says relative effect size, it's going to compare how effective you are to other clinicians in our database. That's right, isn't that some scary stuff right there? Yeah, it's better to live in denial and think you're effective and attend lots of CE events than to really know how effective we are. Here's the good news. Most of you will find, as I find, that we're average, and that's very good. As you've heard me say in other presentations, average treated client in the US, at least in the research that we have, is better off than 80% of the untreated sample. So on that relative effect size line, if you're hitting right about 0, that means you are average. If you're slightly lower than that, it means one of two things. There are not enough cases in the system yet to give you an accurate view of your effectiveness, or number two, you now know where your edge of professional development lies. This is a place where you can go to work and try to improve both engagement and outcome of the clients you see. How can you do that? Well, what you're going to do is get some kind of graph that compares your clients' progress, your individual client's progress, to how people like them progress over time. This isn't fixed in stone. It's merely a jumping off point, a place to discuss with your client. If clients are scoring in the green zone, then they're scoring more like people who end your work with you successfully. If they're scoring in the red zone, then at that particular time, they're scoring more like people who end unsuccessfully, which gives you and the client a crucial opportunity to adjust what you're doing. Make sense? I'm going to be talking about this in detail on Sunday in a 2-hour workshop on feedback-informed treatment. In the meanwhile, what I'd like to do is move into just a brief demonstration of some key skills that we think you should have if you're going to begin using outcome measurement. So, one of those key skills is about introducing the measures and trying to engage the client in the process of filling out the forms. Seems like it should be quite simple because, of course, there are only 4 questions. And yet what we find is that most of the difficulties that arise when doing feedback-informed work take place in that first crucial 2 or 3 minutes, when the therapist is trying to invite the client into giving feedback both about their progress and the outcome. So Bob has volunteered to act as if this is our first visit, and I'm going to ask him to fill out the form. Afterwards, I'll stop, point out the various things I said that we think are crucial to say when you introduce the form. All right, Bob. Please call me Scott.
Nice to meet you, Scott.
Welcome here.
Thank you.
We work a little bit differently than you may be accustomed to. I don't know, have you had an experience being in therapy before?
No, this is my first time.
Okay, good. Then let me just explain to you how the process works for us. We want to make sure when you come to see us that you're getting what you want. And so each time you come, I'd like to ask you to fill out a brief measurement tool. And this tool sort of tells me whether or not the things we're doing together are actually helping. It's based on how you experience things outside of the office. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
And so the form actually asks you to look back over the last week, including today, and then make a mark on 4 different lines. Individually, how things are going for you personally. Interpersonally, in your relationships, and generally that means close relationships, family, loved ones, things like that. Socially, work, if you were in school, friendships, more outside the home. And then kind of an overall catch-all category. Just how are things? Maybe an average of the first 3 could be something that we don't ask about. Does this make sense?
So to the left side means I feel worse?
Yes.
Or not so good?
Yes.
Lower? Okay, and the right.
Yeah, and so
okay.
this cursor, we'll just move it right here, and you can put a mark anywhere along this line. Low scores to the left, high scores to the right.
Okay.
And here's what we know about this kind of work. If what I know is going to be of help to you, then you should see signs of that sooner rather than later. This doesn't have to take years in order to be helpful. Weeks is when you should start seeing that something is happening. If it does, we can keep going. No limits. I'll see you for as long as you like.
Okay.
Sort of like your dentist, in a way.
Okay.
Right? You can come and have checkups, etc. However, if it's not working, then I will change and adjust and adapt to try to make a better fit and see if I can't find something more to do. If that doesn't work, maybe we could discuss, do we need to add something to this? Additional kinds of services, talk to other people, attend a group, potentially. And last but not least, sometimes, not often, but sometimes, I just am not the right person. I just don't know the thing that will help you. In that case, when that does happen, I promise I'll work with you to find some place or someone that can be of more help. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Do you have any questions about that?
Does everybody do this?
You mean therapists?
Yeah.
Not yet. But I do have plans. I think it's good when people like yourself ask that. Ask how will we know if it's working? So I think that's an important part of it. And I don't know if you know, but my profession as a psychologist is actually asked people coming for services what prevents most from going. 78% say they are not sure it will work for them. And so by having you fill this out, we're going to see if it's working or not. And if it's not working, nothing to fear. We'll work it out.
That's good because I'm not sure.
Perfect. You're not sure about it working. Well, let's try and see what happens.
Okay.
And so does this make sense to you then?
Yeah.
And all you need to do is just move this along the line, and then you just left click there. Good. Perfect. There we go. And does that feel about right if you look them over?
Yeah, that looks right for me. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here's the cool part. When I hit the done button here, the computer gives us a signal and tells us how are things, and you've gotten the green signal. That green signal, if you read in the box, it says the client scored more like people who are in and likely to benefit from clinical services. Begin treatment as usual.
That's good. I'm crazy like everybody else.
Well, I guess it could be viewed that way. It basically says you're in the right place, that there are some things that you would like to work on and try to sort through. Make sense?
Yeah.
One other really nice aspect of this is it gives us kind of a timeline about when those changes should happen. And if you look at the graphic here, you'll see if over time we're at our first score right here, which looks like it's about an 18 or so, that blue line that cuts across the screen, if from visit to visit you're at or around that blue line, then we're on track. And if we're below that blue line or around the red line, then we should talk about it and I should figure out what more I need to do.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
So I do this every time I come see you?
Yes. Every time, hopefully in the beginning, we sit down, chat, fill it out, and then we can talk about whether or not what we did the last time made a difference for you.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I did notice, Bob, that when looking just at the individual scores, that the interpersonal item, that second one, was a little bit lower than the rest.
Yeah.
Is that the place you'd like to start or some other place?
Yeah, I'm having a lot of trouble in my relationship, so that's really the biggest thing for me.
Okay, perfect. Can we stop here?
Yeah.
You've seen us introduce and have the ORS scored. There were a number of items that we said, and Bob, feel free to jump in here at any time to comment on them. One was to simply invite them in by saying, each week we're going to monitor and measure the progress. I always say I work a little differently than you may be accustomed to. Why? Because quite often people have never done anything like this, especially if they've been in services before. I then say, if what we do works, then we can continue for as long as you like. So if you're doing better from visit to visit, I'm not going to kick you out. This has nothing to do with managed care or insurance. When it's working, more services are better than fewer services. The third and last thing I say is that if what we do doesn't work, I'll do one of three things. I will adjust, I will adjust in consultation with you about what we're doing here. The second thing is that I'll try to discuss with you who else and what else we should be doing. Do we need to add auxiliary services, additional services? And if that doesn't work, around 8 to 10 weeks or so into this process, then I'll work with you to find someone else or someplace else to go. This is the introduction of the ORS. From there, I then noticed that when Bob filled out the measure, that the scores in one particular area were lower. And I asked about that. Quite often, this simply indicates to the client that we're already started, makes a nice transition into a more traditional therapeutic conversation. That's the introduction. I ask you, if you're going to begin using outcome tools, don't shortchange the introduction. Please don't treat the ORS or whatever outcome tool you use as a bookend. The thing you do at the beginning, then you do your magic, and then you do the other scale at the end. Rather, really take the time to introduce and engage the client in the process throughout using the measurement tools. Last, you saw the graph, and I'm going to show the client the graph at each and every visit, much as you would if you saw your physician for high blood pressure. Is the medication working? Is the dietary and exercise routine actually resulting in a lowering of blood pressure? Are your scores in line with scores that are appropriate for you as a person if we're making progress? We then do our session. And when we do our session, we talk about whatever style you want to do, and we're going to end our session by completing the SRS. Once again, let me just take a brief moment and introduce the SRS to Bob, and then we can begin to field questions if you have them. So, Bob.
Scott.
You recall at the beginning of the session I said that we fill out these tools. You filled out one of them, and I always like to end the conversation I have with people with a second measure, a tool that is a little bit different. This is more about how you felt like things went here between us. Whether or not you felt like I heard what you were saying and that we identified what you want to work on, and whether or not you feel like the approach fits for you or something's missing. So it's very simple like the last time, 4 questions. But let me say before you fill it out that I'm not interested in perfect scores. A 10 out of 10 doesn't mean much to me, really. Life's not perfect, and neither am I. You don't have to worry about hurting my feelings here. I'd really like to know, how was it for you? I guess I should say one other small thing. Sometimes you may feel like I was completely off. That happens on occasion. But most of the times, these are small things that you may think, it's not even worth mentioning. I'd like it if you mentioned it so that we can talk about it and decide that together. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
So let me show you this scale. It's called the SRS, or the Session Rating Scale. And again, it has 4 basic questions. The relationship. And the scores go from negative to positive. So I did not feel heard, understood, or respected, and I did. Same for goals and topics. Did we cover what you hoped we would cover during our time together? And approach and method. Did it feel like it was a good fit, or was there something missing that you were hoping for? And then last but not least is overall, kind of a catch-all question. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Would you be willing to do that?
Yes.
Perfect. Now, Bob gave on the form let's just total this up here and look at the graph. Bob gave a score of 31.2. And if you look at the computer screen, it says 90% of those who complete this scale score higher. I'm hoping that that sort of does the same thing as taking you by the shoulders as a clinician and giving you a good shake. It's basically saying, this really is important to pay attention to. The cutoff on the SRS is actually 35-36. Scores below 36 are considered poor. When he marked the form, and I think this takes some practice, especially if you feel like you've been present, heart and soul with your client, and then they basically say, you suck. That a practiced presence of calmness and not panic and not defensiveness needs to be there. If you cannot do this without being defensive, then don't do the measures. The point here is to get clients to tell us. What we did is took apart the individual items in large measure because Bob started talking and identified what it was that seemed not to be going well in the process. He mentioned the approach and method that we somehow got off track. I simply tried to understand that. Bob, do you have anything to add or your experience of this?
Well, just I was purposeful in moving the slider around on the last domain because that happens a lot. Clients will look and then they'll change it and they'll make an adjustment. Sometimes they can't even say why. And so Scott asking me questions about that degree of attention, I think, really makes a difference. It lets the client know you're really listening and paying attention and noticing. And sometimes they can't explain exactly why, which was my ambiguous response, but that's what happens. And there's also a sense from some clients they feel like, well, if I mark it a little lower, I'm hurting your feelings, or I don't want you to feel bad about yourself, and they'll go into a protective mode even though they have one foot out the door. So you won't find, you'll find quite a few clients that are second guessing themselves as they're doing it. So.
Right. I think all of these things you've said, Bob, are really critical. And the one that I want to underscore is that when you first start this, you may get very little feedback. You'll get perfect scores on the SRS. And I'm telling you, and Bob's telling you, don't take that shit seriously. Because a 40 may simply be, can I go now, please, when they fill it out. The second thing we say, and I said in the workshop on Wednesday, was you get 3 chances to deconstruct the client's feedback. You're at the end of your visit. They know the time is up. You're waiting. Your other person that you're going to see next is waiting. 3 questions is what you get. After 3 questions, if you haven't gotten any specific feedback, then you need to give up because you're just becoming annoying after that. One last piece I hope you saw is that when Bob gave feedback and I was trying to understand it, then he hinted, and this was spontaneous, we hadn't planned this, but he hinted that, I'm not sure if I would have come back. I'm sure I would have set another appointment. 2 things to notice. The scores weren't that low, seemingly, but still a doubt was in his mind about whether or not he was coming back. The second thing to notice is that when that happens and my gut stands up straight and says, wait a second, pay attention to this, this is when I'll say, if you'd like to, you can call me or text me with any further observations. One thing we've learned from top performing clinicians as well, they tend to have more unplanned therapist-initiated contact between visits than average therapists. Now, this doesn't mean we should all, in a sort of evidence-based fashion, start calling our clients between visits. What it means is when your gut tells you they may not be coming back, don't wait for that to happen. Pick up the phone, give them a call, and say, how are you doing? When that happens in healthcare, I think people are mostly shocked that the physician, the dentist, the periodontist, whoever it is that calls you and says, how was it? Are you doing okay? What I'm trying to do at this point is secure ongoing engagement with the client. Does this make sense? Okay. Bob and I thought we'd do one more brief example of the scale with a question that comes up quite often. And that question is, what happens if clients aren't honest on the scale? Let's say a client comes in and they are mandated into care. What do you do then? So let me just start this process over again. And we're going to assume that the introductions for the ORS have been done, and I'm giving Bob, who has been sent here by the courts for whatever reason, I'm giving Bob the ORS. So Bob, would you be willing to fill this out then? Perfect. So let's take a look here at what happens. We get a yellow this time, Bob. And essentially what it says is the client scored more like people who are not in treatment and reporting that they are functioning relatively well. Is that true?
True.
Wow. And so what else, the other things it says is that we need to be quite careful. Because when a person who's doing quite well sees a person like me, there is a large chance that we could make people worse.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So I don't want that to happen. And I'm guessing that if things are going so well and I don't want to make you worse, can I ask you what brought you in? Why might you come see a person like me?
My PO told me, my parole officer said I got to be here, otherwise they're not going to let me drive again. They're going to, they said they might just, put me back in prison.
Wow.
So
you can see a guy like me and I can make you mentally ill, or you can go back to jail.
Yeah, that's right. I'd rather be mentally ill.
Okay.
I didn't have a choice, so.
Right. You're following through. You're doing what they told you, because you don't want to end up violated back in jail.
Yeah.
You want to be able to drive, get out of the house, etc.
I just needed to tell them I'm good.
Okay. Well, the scores certainly say that things are going relatively well. I guess the question is how to convince them of that. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
let me do. I rarely do this, but I'm wondering if I could ask you to fill this out one more time, but fill it out from the perspective of your PO. Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah. All right.
So here we go. Now, and before you fill it out, I want you to think back, not from your perspective, because we know you're doing well. Interpersonally, individually, socially, things are on track. It's just that they don't think so.
Yeah.
And for as long as they don't see you as good, as doing as well as you think you are, then you have to come to a place like this. And I imagine you can think of a bunch of other things you'd rather do.
Yeah.
Okay. So think like that probation officer, he or she?
She.
She. Would you fill it out as if you were her? Perfect. All right, thanks. So she sees things quite different than you do at the present time.
Yeah.
All right, and if we look at those individual marks, one thing you are in closer agreement about is your interpersonal, your relationships. Can you say
Yeah.
something about that? Seems
Yeah,
to be less room there.
That's not what got me there.
It's not what got you there. Would she say you're stronger in that area then?
Yeah, yeah. She'd say.
As a result of what?
Well, she'd just say it's not a big deal. She'd just say, you know, just, you know, be good.
All right.
But she wouldn't really say anything. We haven't really talked about my relationship.
No. Okay. Are you in a relationship?
Yeah.
Okay. Married, single,
girlfriend.
girlfriend.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Some areas where she thinks things are a little bit different, or more different rather, are individually and socially.
Yeah.
So let me ask, what would she have to notice different about you
Well,
that would tell her things were actually the way you say they are, socially or individually?
well, she doesn't believe me when I say I'm not drinking.
Okay.
So she thinks I need to not drink because I've had 3 DUIs.
Okay.
And
All
so
right.
that's what she thinks, but
And that's, which one does that go on? Does that go on both
that's
individual?
up here.
That's the
really,
individual.
Like, she just thinks that I have a problem, and I don't really think I have
Okay.
a problem.
And so you're saying that's handled. You've got that down.
Yeah.
But she's feeling quite different about
Yeah,
that.
she's feeling way
And
different.
the key here, you said, is she has to somehow find out how good things really are.
Yeah.
How's she going to find this out? What would she notice about you that would make her feel more confident about that?
Well, I think she
We
just...
can stop. We can
Okay,
stop
okay.
here.
I was getting into it.
Yeah. So, for Bob and I, for members of the ICC, for people who are doing feedback-informed work, honesty is not a word that you're going to hear used about the measures. It's about taking the perspective of the client and the others around them. And Bob here says things are great. He's obviously not here for treatment of himself. He's here for POD, probation officer disorder. And so that's the problem we're treating. What is it she wants? And most importantly, what is it she needs to see so that she'll feel as confident as you do about how well you're doing, et cetera. And this interview would just continue to unfold depending on your particular style or way of working. This is how we would integrate the measure with a client who is mandated into care.
Or with, like my agency, we work with adolescents a lot. And adolescents, they're not the ones who initiate services. So a lot of times they're scoring very high, and their parents or caregiver, someone else is saying there's a problem. So the same kind of approach.
Perfect. So this is one of the basic skills of feedback-informed work, which is introducing the measures and then integrating the measures into the contact. Again, I'm hoping you won't treat these like bookends, but rather integrate them throughout the conversation you have, much like you saw in the interaction here with Bob when he's role-playing a mandated client. We have about 18 minutes or so left. If you have a question or a comment, we'd love to hear them. Please come up to the microphones, and Bob and I can answer. Maybe we start here to the right, if that's okay. Yes.
All right, thanks, yeah. Excellent stuff, really appreciate it. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you balance the time. So you have 45 minutes or a 50-minute session in a lot of managed care situations. So how do you balance the time, taking that time up front and then still having the time to do the work that you want to do in the session with the client? Thanks.
Well, my response is it's seamless, really. What my experience has been is that clinicians, once they understand the process, it becomes part of their everyday practice, and really the amount of time is so small. It takes usually less than a minute to do the measure. If you hand score it, it takes a little longer. On paper, if you're using an electronic system, the results are instantaneous, but it becomes just part of the everyday process that's used. And yeah.
I think it's the same as setting an appointment. It just becomes, as you say, a routine part of the process. This does take some practice to make that happen. And what's the worst that can happen? You get to the end of a session, 50 minutes, and the client gives you feedback. If you're getting relatively low scores, you will be saving yourself time and other problems by taking that 10 minutes in between visits and talking it over with your client.
I would say to make sure there is time, Scott did well with this, make sure don't just give 2 minutes, because if there's feedback that you need to respond to, you need to make sure there's enough time to be able to get, helpful feedback.
Perfect.
Yes, I'm interested in how this might be applied to a group program. So the participants, the clients are all in groups through this is a 2-week group program. Is there an adaptation or use that could be applied? Thank you.
There are, first off, a lot of people doing groups and discussing how to do this on the ICCE website. So if you're not a member of ICCE, please join. It's absolutely free. There are no ads. There are simply people like yourselves that are struggling to integrate the forms into their work. In addition, manual number 5 in the FIT series that Bob edited, has a whole section about how to do this in groups. Third, there is a special measure, the GSRS, or the Group Session Rating Scale, that we published its first validation study in January of this year. So there is a special scale for groups at the end. You use the same ORS at the beginning of your group. You've added another wrinkle or complication, and that is when you have people in-house for an intensive service process. In that case, you want to treat it, you don't want to do it every time you do a service. Otherwise, it's going to drive the clients crazy. Instead, think of a unit of service, like a week. So you might do the ORS at the beginning of 1 week and the SRS at the end of the week. Those are some potential ideas.
All right. First, I want to thank you for your work. I've been using the ORS and SRS for a little over a year, and it has completely revolutionized the way that I do counseling.
Wow.
I cannot imagine trying to do a counseling session without it. So I thank you for that very much. I guess I just have a really quick question regarding the estimated treatment response. Do you find that that's dependent upon maybe a particular diagnosis or like a community mental health consumer versus a private pay, affluent client? Do you find differences in their treatment responses?
I don't know about private pay versus not private pay, but the system has been used the largest numbers are from public health centers. There's no correlation between client diagnosis and expected treatment response. There's hardly any correlation between diagnosis and treatment outcome. So diagnosis, we don't see any correlation really. What we're looking at is the client's likelihood of improvement over time. How do they experience that? And it just gives us an opportunity, as we've said, that if the client's not responding as expected, we can have a conversation about it.
Hi.
Hi.
Is this on? Okay. Right now I do more psychological assessment than therapy, and although I think many people see assessment as a terminal service or you just are referring on to people, I was wondering if there are tools that your center has developed or that you know of that perhaps assess client satisfaction with debriefing or follow-up or assessing outcomes in that manner.
I'm not sure I understand.
I can say this, that you can use the ORS
Okay.
to triage. So the lower the score, the more you want that client to, in the front of the queue, getting services quickly. Yeah. Not only because they are much more distressed, but also because they're likely to respond. to the services. Secondly, I love that somebody who does assessment wants to find out how did the client experience the work they did. So why not give the SRS at the end of an assessment? Because really, the value of your assessment is increased if the client follows through with the recommendations.
Right.
And that's going to often be dependent not so much on the accuracy of your diagnosis or assessment, but how they felt about you in the process.
Okay.
So lovely.
Thank
In
you.
our web-based system, in my agency, we have individual, family, group therapy, we have school-based services, residential programs, transitional living, and so on. And all of the youth and young adults are put into on the wait list, and it gives, you can see the scores, and we can kind of, as Scott was saying, get an idea of the degree of crisis or severity of their distress, and then we can oftentimes move them into a program that might be a better fit at that point. So it does help us in terms of our response, and in nonprofits and agencies where there's big wait lists, this is a big issue. So.
Yes, I am beginning a sex therapy research study in January, and I'm using both the ORS and the SRS. My questions are, I had thought there was an article about using them where you use both at the beginning of the session to ask how they were thinking about it since they saw you last week, and I wasn't sure if that was correct. So I'm asking about how the use of it. In other words, it's a 15-week program that I'm going to be taking them through. Should I do it every week? I actually have it planned to do every week for the first 6 weeks and then every other for the last half. And then do you have a manual for those doing it manually?
Let's take the last question first. There is a series of manuals that Bob edited and many people in the room contributed to. I'm very proud of these manuals because they were written by a team of practitioners who've actually implemented these things around the globe. Cynthia Mayschalk is here in the audience. She contributed a huge amount to their construction, et cetera. You can get those on my website at scottdmiller.com. There are 6 of them that go through various aspects. They're simple reads. They're not technically complicated or citing tons of research. It's really kind of how to. I don't know of any, I'm sure there's somebody who's done the SRS at the beginning and asked about the prior time, but I'm not aware of that. The question you ask about frequency of use, here's a key. We often have programs, and I'm not trying to knock it, but if the feedback cannot change what you're doing, then why ask for feedback? So if your feedback is set, or if your program is set, and people are going to go and I know you may not be saying that, but if they're going to go inexorably through this regardless of their progress or feelings about it, then don't use the measures. It will just be infuriating to people. Secondly, the frequency has to be determined individually. If your client has a low score and the expected treatment response is steep, but your client's not changing, then you should continue to use the measure on an ongoing weekly basis at a minimum. If, however, your client has reached the expected treatment response, after that you can begin to space out the administration. So it has to be based on the individual's response to the services offered as opposed to some set time limits when we assess.
Great, thank you.
Part of my question was answered by the gentleman's question here. So the other part of the question was, have you found this in your clinical practice to be of value when you have a clinical rupture in a session in augmenting that and repairing it? Second part of the question is, on both ends of the spectrum where you have people that are more passive, say, and they're people-pleasing, and so they're giving you high scores, or the other part of the spectrum where they're very kind of passive-aggressive and not telling you what they're doing wrong. Do you find that it's a good avenue for conversation within the therapy, especially when there's been a rupture in therapy?
I don't know how to say this, but I'll just say it directly. I don't know any passive-aggressive people. I'm serious. I do know therapists who talk about passive-aggressive people. And I don't say this to be funny. I say that we're shifting the burden to the client when we say they were passive-aggressive with us and that's why they didn't get feedback. It's not their job to give us the feedback. It's our job to get it. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm being mean or tough. What I would say is, it's not because they are dishonest or passive aggressive or passive. You didn't get the feedback, figure out how you're going to get it. And so what you'll need to do in order to do that is sit down and plan for this and deliberately practice. How are you going to get feedback from people, all kinds of people? And when you don't get it, if you're getting all high scores, that's the thing to notice. And sit down and think about, what's it going to take for me to get it from that person?
Yeah.
So
Practice, practice.
I'm hoping that what you find also is that when the client's using this, and there's a conversation that's able to come up about all of these high scores, that they're taking more responsibility for their own health and their own healing.
This sounds like a therapist agenda to me.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Scott, you're the second person at this conference to mention texting with clients,
Yeah.
and yet ethics, law and ethics presentations I've gone to have said steer away from it, especially in training agencies, because it
Yeah.
might be a junior person who's getting a personal text on their own space.
Yeah.
So I wondered how you do that.
You know, you'll have to decide if you can the degree you can tolerate the risk. I think I'm interested in engaging clients. And right now we're in an ethical borderline gray area about all this. And I think there'll probably need to be some test cases, et cetera. I find it appalling that we can't call, that we can't text, that we see ourselves as only delivering services in a room face to face. It's one of the reasons why our field is slowly dying, that we can't reach out and engage people, you know.
Thank you.
Will you please all come to my ethics defense?
Okay, so this is just a comment of gratitude, and I've been using the system at a counseling agency that I volunteer for, and it's a humbling experience as
Yeah.
a young mental health provider, and I intend to use this throughout my whole professional career, so thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Let me say one other thing about that. We have some brand new research that was done, I mentioned on Wednesday, by Daryl Chow. This humbling comment it really strikes in my heart. In fact, my hairs on the back of my neck are raising. Daryl found that one thing that separated the best therapists from the rest, listen to this, was that they were more frequently surprised by client feedback. If you let that sink in for a minute, I hope you interpret it the same way. When you've heard it all, you've heard nothing about that client. So when people are surprised, it's like, oh my God, this is new. I can act differently. I can go in a different direction. So maintaining that sense of, wow, a new person in my office, that's a big challenge in our work. Once you've heard it all, you're listening to nothing anymore. So I think it's beautiful what you said.
I'd like to just make a quick comment. I'm glad you formalized the process. I was sitting in my office one day and I said, there are 3 questions I'm not asking. And that is, do you feel listened to? Do you feel respected? And do you think I'm the right therapist with the methods that I'm using? And the client said, why, are you afraid you're going to lose your job? And you know, to tell you the truth, I wanted to know.
Yeah.
And it struck them so odd that I would ask those questions, and I thought, we as a profession need more feedback, not less.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that brief comment.
Yeah.
What I've noticed about our therapists, there's about 50 therapists at our agency, and we've been using the measures for about 10 years, and they are, the one thing that would break their hearts is if they knew that they weren't helping their clients. That's the one thing. And so they incessantly talk about this and are puzzling over it and talking with each other, and it's gratifying to watch because you can learn so much just watching them, listening to their conversations, but they care. That's really what matters. I think it's a big step in that direction of engagement for the purposes of something bigger.
And make sure that you integrate that comment into your introduction of the SRS. You know, when you give it, simply say, this really has nothing to do with my keeping my job or getting fired from my job. Mm-hmm. It really has all to do with me finding out, am I giving you what you want, and I'm truly interested. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In residential settings, particularly working with adolescents, I'm wondering, are you extending the SRS specifically to the parents of the adolescents as well, evaluating your performance with them as well as with the adolescent? And then secondly, have you guys ever extended the SRS to staff in residential, the academic department in residential, and to those other, because treatment isn't isolated just in therapy. It's an experience as a whole.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could address both of those, if you would.
So those are all great ideas. What we do is we use the SRS specifically with the case manager or the therapist, but we don't send it out to the parent because we kind of feel like that's more client satisfaction. It's after the fact. It's not really in the moment feedback. But whenever we can get them engaged, we are asking them questions. Maybe not on the form, but we are asking them about their perceptions and what we can do differently. We have used the SRS in residential settings to get a pulse of what the kids feel like is happening in terms of their experience on a particular day. But it's not used in relationship to like an ORS. They're comfortable with the form, and so they'll ask the kids, hey, can you fill one of these out about how you feel like you're doing today and how you feel like things are going with staff, and they'll do it on any given shift at any point in time. Now, I know that's not how it was designed, but they appreciate the value of that feedback. So, but much of that's what we're going to find, I think, down the road is the kind of stuff you're talking about is, let's see what can be done.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have kind of a cross between a question and misgiving about both instruments. For the SRS, it seems to me it would work best with non-relationship focused therapies like CBT, because if you're analytic, for example, that would it seems to me that it would introduce a third person in the relationship, the forms. Or if you're something like client-centered, this is stuff that should be coming out in the interview itself. So it feels like it's kind of for relationship-focused therapies that it's shifting the relationship to something other than the therapist. And I'll say the other part and then shut up. As to the other one, the outcome, it seems like what you're doing is persuading the client something about his experience other than what he's experiencing, that you're saying things like, well, you're not as, I'm hypothetical, I'm hyperbolizing, you're not as bad off as you think you are, look at this graph, or you're better off than you think you are. And I'm done. Thank you.
Was there a question?
Well, I could have said, is it true that? I don't mean to be disputing. I'm troubled by both, and I wanted your response. I'm not trying to argue.
No, that's fine. I'd say read more. Read more about the materials. I think these are important questions that you ask, or comments that you make. And download the articles on the website. They're free. And read a bit more and see if it doesn't address some of those concerns, which I think are important. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you all for coming.